are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Keeping Things Running, Business Continuity in the Age of COVID-19. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a couple of ground rules for today's presentation. All microphones have been placed on mute. Should you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the questions tab and we'll get to them at the end as if time permits. Additionally, if you are attending this webinar for CPE credit, you will notice some polling questions throughout the webinar. You will need to complete those polling questions in order to receive your CPE certification. At this point, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. As a manager for Bloom, Eric Brown has over 25 years of combined experience with IT infrastructure, operations, advisory services, and information security. He has worked with both publicly traded and private businesses in overall IT strategy, IT operations, risk management, process improvement, remote administration, and disaster recovery. And as you can see, everything else about that slide here is correct in terms of Eric's information, except for the name right there. So for those of you who've been on our presentations, you know that that's not Jeff, that is Eric Brown. As a director at Bloom Shapiro, David Nowacki has over 18 years of combined experience with management advisory and information security. He has worked with both government agencies and private businesses in setting strategies, reviewing and assessing operations, governance and enterprise risk management practices, project and program management practices, information security programs, and identifying process improvement opportunities. David is an integral member of the firm's risk advisory group specializing in cyber services. David has also helped a variety of organizations define, document, and refine their strategies and business processes, identify automation opportunities, select technology solutions to realize efficiencies, and integrate metrics and key performance indicators into business processes. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Eric Brown to begin today's presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to go through all these different initiatives with us. So today's goals are really going to be revolving around the impact of hybrid business models on present and future IT operations, business continuity, and business resiliency, and a discussion remote versus on-site technology implications for your organizations. So we're going to try to go through each one of these and identify certain activities that could certainly help you with that. So I'm going to hand this over to David Nowacki for hybrid model implications.
Yeah, so the concept of a hybrid business model, I think, is emerging out of the pandemic, and in order to keep your operations, your people, your strategies adaptable to a variety of circumstances, I think we have to embrace the hybrid business model. And so, what has changed? There has been a rapid expansion, certainly back in the spring, of remote workforce and virtual adaptations of your operations, how you communicate and work together, how you connect to systems, how operations are conducted, whether you're in the service or service sector, or you're in the product sector, or you're in government. Everything has changed significantly, and it happened very fast. And so what we need to be looking at as we get out of the pandemic or start to see the end in the next 2 to 3 quarters, hopefully sooner than later, is that business will have changed forever. And I think you need to embrace hybrid business models as a strategy. On the employee front, it's going to be a benefit of working at an organization. And if you can't compete on that front, if you can't offer flexible, nimble, remote work environment, you may not be out there in the talent strategy environment and be able to compete with other organizations. And so, what does your organization look like today, and how does it need to grow and adapt and evolve to enable this hybrid concept to be in place for the foreseeable future? So, looking at a variety of bullet points on, what needs to be done at home, what employees need to be doing, how is that different from a physical work environment? Looking at policies and procedures, I would say it's an opportunity to update everything that you have in terms of policies, procedures, processes as well. What What does accountability and security look like in a hybrid work environment? We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. How do you make sure that you're engaging in training and developing your employees in a non-physical world? Does their employment experience extend outside the walls? How has supervision changed when you can't be in a physical presence all of the time? What does that look like? Have you actually invested in automation and digitization processes? It's time to rethink those paper-based manual processes and look at how you can automate and realize efficiencies, minimize the necessity for physical presence. Looking at the rapid expansion of your threat surface area, as we often talk about, it extends to everybody's work environment and their home environment as well, in terms of personal devices and home Wi-Fi networks and neighbors who may be snooping on traffic and Internet of Things and smart home devices. So all of this is expanding your potential threat surface area. And I think that last bullet point there is vitally important, is like, how have your processes and strategies changed operationally, not just the technology side, but how have things changed? How do you need to start looking at personnel strategy and succession planning? How do you ensure your operations are continuous and resilient to these types of threats? And so we're going to get into that quite a bit in the coming sections. But moving on to the next slide.
All right, we've got our first poll question here for CPE credit. It's out there now. Again, if you are attending for CPE credit, you will need to complete the polling questions. And we'll keep this open for a few more seconds here to give everyone the opportunity to participate. Great, give it just another couple seconds here to get the last few participants in. Great, thank you everybody.
Okay, so why don't we move to the next slide, business continuity and resiliency. So the one thing that I kind of wanted to touch upon here in this particular section is business continuity and resiliency, and really what is the difference between the two. And we're going to go through each of these. Business continuity is in one section, and we'll go through business resiliency in another section. So business continuity is defined as the process of creating systems of prevention and recovery to deal with potential threats to a company. In addition to prevention, the goal is to enable ongoing operations before and during execution of disaster recovery. Next slide, please. And to put together a business continuity plan is made up of approximately 10 steps. The most important piece is assembling the correct planning team. Without a dedicated team and support from senior management, the plan's really never going to go anywhere unless it's supported from above. And that way you'll be assured that it'll be something that's taken seriously and everybody will understand how important this is for the company and be able to execute a strategy. The second piece is to draw up the business continuity plan itself. And generally the way you do that is, this also goes into the next bullet point, is you conduct a business impact analysis with a group of people from each functional vertical in a business. And that's generally done in a meeting where you sit around a conference table and you go through the exercise of determining, okay, if we lose our finance system, how do we perform business? How long would it take us to get the finance system back, depending on what the nature of the disaster is? And it starts with that. Then you go through the various other functional verticals that you have. You go through manufacturing. If you have a manufacturing operation, how are those systems impacted by some kind of outage? Go through HR. You go through all the different functional verticals that you have with the different applications, different technologies that are involved in those processes. And then you try to determine a list of what that looks like, and you draw up a plan around the list of applications and technologies that are impacted. Then you would educate and train through the process of an escalation process of what if scenarios. That's a big piece of this. And then from that, you should be able to derive a plan. So the other subsequent steps are you have to isolate the sensitive information first. Next slide, please, Jared. That's important to make sure you have an understanding of where it is, how it's protected, how it's backed up, and the sensitive information really is, HR data, intellectual property, any kind of what I call crown jewels of your corporation that make up your intellectual property. It's super important to make sure you isolate that, know how that is being backed up, protected, and what your strategy is to protect that. Then you also have to back up the other important data, which is, any kind of email files, any kind of other data that's associated with manufacturing the products in your environment. Then the other piece of that is the hard copy data. So, we're pretty much in a digital world today, but we still have a lot of hard copy documents that have to be dealt with. So we have to make sure that we have a plan that addresses the securing and safeguarding of those documents. Then, depending on the size and shape of your organization, you can designate a recovery site. It depends on if you're a manufacturing organization, things like that are a little bit more difficult to rationalize. If you're a bank, that's a little bit also a different type of recovery scenario. But with today's companies, traditionally in the mid-market, like we're all doing today, a recovery site would be either working from home or working from another place that has a strong internet connection. So that would really be, kind of applicable to most of the mid-market companies. Set up a communications program. It's important to be able to stay in touch during any type of disaster or any type of, big type of corporate endeavor anyway. So setting up a communication program with an escalation strategy and approach is hugely important. The other part of this is you have to test, measure, and update the plan. The one thing you don't want to do is learn how to perform your disaster recovery exercise when you're in the midst of an emergency. So this is, the worst time to try to do that. So we recommend that at least on an annual, or depending on the nature of your business, quarterly, you can also do pieces of this, but test and measure and update the disaster recovery plan. Make sure it's working. Make sure all the backup systems are working. Make sure that all the secondary sites are up and running. All those types of things have to be measured. And if things aren't working, you have to be updated and they have to be tested again. But we also recommend that you also memorialize the outcomes of these tests. So that way you're also performing continuous improvement around these types of operations. That's extremely important. Next slide, Jared. So again, assembling the planning team. Many organizations assign a business continuity manager that will be responsible for leading and planning the preparedness process as well as executing the plan during an incident. One of their biggest responsibilities is to assemble a suitable team and governance system. So next slide, please, Jared. So once that person's been identified, they'll be able to get the proper people involved to make sure that you can develop a correct plan that'll span across all the functional verticals in the company. That's really the most important piece. You also have to be the quarterback or the champion of the process itself. So when the disaster happens or any kind of business units impacted, they will be primarily responsible for executing the escalation process, make sure that all the people are brought into the loop, and you begin to execute against the plan. So creating the business continuity plan itself, the most important thing, again, with the identification of the manager would be to identify the scope. The scope meaning the systems that are involved, all the functional verticals that are impacted. And then that person would also really be responsible for conducting the impact analysis, which is that exercise where you go across the table with all the folks that are involved in the functional verticals to determine how the business would be impacted and what is the best path back to get the company back up and running. Next slide, please, Jared. Then the other piece that person would be responsible for would be creating the communication structure, create the escalation policy and the procedure. This would be the list of people that would be identified when the disaster hits. So it would start with the primary person who would be responsible for engaging, all of the directors, all the company managers to make sure that the escalation policy does make sense, that all the people are being brought into the loop that makes sense. And again, we would test this policy procedure at least on an annual basis. And again, depending on how big your company is, potentially testing that on a quarterly basis, memorializing the results to make sure you're conducting continuous improvement along the way. Okay, next slide, Jared. Educate and train. So this part is also crucial, and it's about practicing as well. So we have to train the staff and then practice the steps. So we have to make sure that everybody who's involved in the process knows what their responsibilities and obligations are to perform these tasks. Then perform the drills, record the results, update the policies and procedures as necessary. Next slide, Jared. Data information. And again, we have to figure out where that sensitive information is, how that's backed up, how it's protected, and how we can report against it. So again, depending on the nature of your business, you may want to also be able to report against how those files are being accessed, who's accessing those files, and where that data really winds up going in and out of your company. And again, we have to back up the most important data to make sure we have a clear understanding of where that is. We have to test those backups on a regular basis. We have to perform drills against this data recovery. So one thing I like to do as well, if we have a backup system in place, depending on, again, the size of your company, I like to do test restores, sometimes on a weekly basis, just to make sure we're getting what we think we're getting out of our backup system. We record those results. And again, if we have any failures or any problems with those backups at all, we record those results and make sure that we take steps to remediate any kind of problems with those backup issues. Okay, next slide, Jared. Okay, back to a poll question.
Yes, thanks, Eric. Second poll question is up now and open. Again, if you are attending for CPE credit, you do have to participate in these polling questions here to get that certification. Keep this open for another 10-15 seconds here to get everyone who needs to participate in there. Great, thank you, everybody.
Okay, so I'm going to hand this over to David for business resilience.
So the concept of business resilience has really come alive this year. It's been around for 5 to 10 years, but it's really come alive this year. And think of the business continuity as Eric was describing is more of a traditional approach, and it typically assumes an outage due to a discrete event that has a start and end. That may be more predictable and usually recovers a pretty defined recovery time period and pretty clearly defined strategies. I think business resiliency is one of those things that it spans your entire business. It's a business-wide term. It both includes your crisis management, incident response, and business continuity. It's really your resiliency of your business, your operations, your technologies. It's a reflection on your ability to rapidly adapt and respond to a variety of risks. Maybe you don't know what they are. Natural disasters, cyber attacks, supply chain issues, the global pandemic, a number of other things that you may not be able to control, political pressures, other things like that. And so it extends significantly beyond business continuity and really starts to look at a variety of areas. And so if we transition here to the next slide, there are basically 5 pillars of resilience. And so we'll go over these in the coming slides, but do you understand the commercial impacts of a variety of factors that could change? Risks factors, threat factors. Have you been anticipating and building adaptable systems from the commercial side to really look at, anticipate, and respond to those types of pressures? Business design. Have you designed your governance, whether you're led by a board or whether it's just a management and executive leadership team? Have you designed your discussions, your processes, and your business to be able to evaluate, respond, and adapt accordingly? Operations, I talked about this at the onset about hybrid business models, but how have you, How have you positioned your operations, your workforce, to minimize disruptions and maximize uptime and availability of services? And how does that look across your business? Looking at supply chain, your vendors, your suppliers, do you have clear visibility into their resilience? And so this starts that spiral of unknowns that you need to make sure that you can start to gather information on and make smart, risk intelligent decisions as it exists to external parties and business partners. Finance and structuring, and how are you investing assets today, knowing that there may be uncertainty in the future, but also is funding have some disruption in it? And so transitioning to the next slide, we'll go through each one of these sections and kind of give you some examples of the types of things you need to be looking at. Jared, next slide. Commercial excellence. So are you looking at things, market scenarios, what your competitors may be doing? Are you looking at what the macroeconomic factors are? What is the economy doing? Interest rates and markets fluctuating. What does that look like for your organization? Have you never considered it before because you're a pretty stable organization? Maybe you're in a stable sector in manufacturing that's been around for a long time and there hasn't been much disruption. Maybe your contracts are longer, so you haven't thought about this before, but things have changed and we need to make sure that we adapt to that. What are the risks specific to your organization from a commercial and a market perspective? If you lose a major contract, a major customer, because they pull back as a result of this, the pandemic or other market scenarios, what does that do to you if your revenue takes a 30% hit and you lose a major customer, for example? Have you done the age-old SWOT analysis, right? The strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You probably need to revisit that from a resilience perspective and really calculate a lot of uncertainty and maximize your threats, your threat calculation. Really maximize the emphasis on your weaknesses, and really start to look at how adaptable and nimble you can become. Next slide. Looking at your business design. So this is how your governance processes are designed. Do you have a team that has visibility into a variety of scenarios, in terms of being able to anticipate and respond to threats? Have you looked at things like cyber attacks differently? Have you looked at things like a key technology vendor not being around tomorrow? Have you done the exercises, the strategic and operational planning exercises that absolutely deal with the doom and gloom? Short-term unpredictable outages, and what are you going to do to respond to that? And have you aligned your ERM principles, enterprise risk management principles, to be adaptable? And again, revisiting things like the appetite for risk, with respect to not being able to serve your customers or members or constituents. Have you adapted that to zero, or with zero tolerance? Have there been other areas where you think that there's a certain amount of risk you're willing to accept, given that you can't do everything with your budget and your resources? So have you designed your governance processes to be able to adapt to this? Next slide, please. Considering that operational excellence, have you looked across your organization? And we'll take workforce as the one example, but was everybody, throughout your organization, as an immediate response to the global pandemic, did everybody have the same uptime requirements? Meaning zero outages. How did you prioritize those individuals who got VPN access first, or a new laptop, or access to their systems in the cloud? How did you determine that, and how did that feed back into your operational planning? Have you considered, which service or which product or which process needed to be most available, most resilient to an outage like this? What do those critical functions look like? Which one of those can exist in a virtual environment going forward? Did that did anything change across your business operations from a product service development and delivery, from your people and talent management process, your physical presence in terms of where you're placing your services, your products, how you're delivering services? Did that change? And does marketing and promotion change as well? This is operational excellence. You may not be doing those same things in the same manner going forward. And are your employees and your human resources as productive as they need to be? Transition to the next slide. Supply chain, I talked about this a couple minutes ago, but have you risk rated vendors and suppliers? Do you understand the impact and how resilient they may or may not be? Do you know which ones you could replace within a month to 3 months? And are they critical or not? Do you know ones that would take years to replace and your organization is wholly dependent upon that? Have you looked at a vendor diversification strategy before in terms of getting different vendors that can do the same thing and ensuring you have succession between vendors and backups between vendors? Has your third-party risk management process changed altogether? Are you asking the right questions prior to engaging with them about business resilience, about solvency, about their economic, outlay, and their ability to respond to things? Because it's vital to existing in this day and age from a resiliency perspective. Next slide. Looking at financing, and so things have changed tremendously on the finance structuring side. And some industries, people are willing to invest, and others, there was a complete pullback in terms of being able to being able and willing to invest at the same level pre-pandemic, right? And so what does that impact, like what was the impact on your business from a financing perspective, from a borrowing perspective, from not knowing what your revenue looks like for 1 or 2 quarters, and how that impacts your ability to obtain funding? Investing in technologies, making sure that they're sustainable technologies, that they're nimble and adaptable, and not to throw a softball out there, but one of the easiest things that I would say every organization needs to consider is never buying a desktop computer again. Always issue laptops when you can. And so that's a concept that I think you need to make sure that you're able to invest in confidently going forward. Do you understand the fiscal impact on your organization for non-resilience? What's the consequence if you're out for 2, 3, 4 days, or you can't sustain a service or product delivery, volume or quantity or quality in a hybrid work environment? What's the consequence for that? And are you investing in those technologies and processes that are necessary to enable a timely either recovery or completely minimizing the likelihood of outages altogether across those critical business areas? So this expands way beyond the concepts of a typical business continuity disaster recovery strategy, and really into how your organization can adapt to and respond. And I like to use a visual of a rubber band, a thick rubber band, that you kind of stretch at different speeds, and what levels or what sections of your company would snap first. Which ones need to be stronger as you stretch it slowly, quickly? Can you rebuild that rubber band and strengthen it? And so it's really one of those things that is across your organization and needs to be thought of today as we head into the future, and not knowing what the environment's going to look like going forward. So transitioning to the next slide, I think we have another poll question.
Great, we've got another poll question up. We'll keep it up for about 30 seconds or so here to get everyone involved. Just a few more seconds here to get everyone involved. Again, if you are attending for CPE credit, you will need to complete the polling questions. just keep it open for another few seconds here to get some last participants in. All right, thank you, everyone.
Okay, so next slide, Jared. Okay, so where do we go from here? So on the upcoming slides, we're really going to talk about the review of the prior concepts. But the biggest piece of this is, to David's point from the slides earlier, is the difference between disaster recovery, business continuity, and business resilience. So again, we're just going to talk about business resilience for one moment. So when you think about business resilience, and again, back to David's point where, if everybody had laptops and we were prepared for the pandemic, from a business resiliency standpoint, it would have been as simple as going to remote locations where we would be isolated and still accessing all of our business applications and being able to conduct business normally. So that's the goal of business resilience, is to have no interruption regardless of what's happening in the world around us. And that's really the most important differentiation between that business resilience and then disaster recovery. So the goal really to get to 100% effectiveness with business resilience is to have a free-flowing way of performing those applications, and being able to make sure that you can be able to execute business from a remote location without any kind of interruption. Okay, you go to the next screen, Jared. Okay, the COVID-19 pandemic quickly forced many businesses to remote work environments without any kind of preparation. So we're going to be discussing policies and procedures. What policies and procedures related to remote and on-site computing? And we'll offer some insights into the best practices to keep your organization safe. And we're going to discuss how Bloom can help you assess and remediate the risks of your remote work strategy. So next slide. Okay, Telework Transformation. So again, going back to business continuity, it's a big piece of this, making sure you have an understanding of your continuity and resiliency, processes and responsibilities, bringing the office to your employees. So a lot of this revolves around some of the virtualization technologies. So a lot of companies started using applications like Teams to be able to share files, SharePoint, to be able to provide file storage and document management systems. Also integrating with your managed services, the way your IT is being run and being attended to now. And again, processes and procedures, we have to make sure that you have the right teleworking processes, procedures, and policies. And should we have productivity monitoring? How does that really integrate with your current HR strategies and policies? Protecting your organization. You have to do that with security monitoring, phishing, training. We've talked about training previously, but again, performing email phishing campaigns and other kind of ongoing training is also kind of critical. And again, communications and being able to leverage your conferencing technology such as Teams and other platforms to make sure that you have that covered as well. And then managing compliance and third-party risk, which we talked about in the previous slides. And again, the third-party risk, how does that affect your organization? If you do have a company that is a primary provider to you for a certain service or a product, how do you mitigate the risk of them having problems with any kind of outside interference like a pandemic? Do you have second-party strategies to make sure you can get those products and services? There's also compliance and regulatory implications with switching providers from a third-party risk perspective, and then there's also privacy concerns with that. Okay, next slide, Jared. So we've already talked about business continuity, the risks and impact. Business operations will not be able to be continued or sustained when working remotely. Data loss will occur, and there is a procedural breakdown. And key processes, and controls are impacted or unable to be performed in a remote environment. So that's part of the business continuity piece. The next slide, Jared. And questions to ask yourself. How often is the plan updated and has it been tested? So we've talked about that. That's very important to do that. Are the critical or essential employees that are connected to make sure we can keep the business open? That's important as well. Do employees have access to essential equipment and technology to complete their jobs remotely? Again, that's those other questions that have to be asked. Have employees been cross-trained on critical applications in case the need arises to step in? And again, that goes back to the training piece. And what processes are changing with the switch to the remote workplace? Next slide, Jared. So bringing the office to your employees, here are the risks and impacts kind of associated with that. So unauthorized intrusion in the corporate environment. So we have to make sure that we have some kind of technology in place to make sure that we have those remote work environments secured, and we can also report against them to make sure that, you know, no corporate data is leaving the environment that shouldn't be. Intellectual property theft and sensitive information, again, one of those things we have to make sure we have that contained properly to make sure we can also report against that, to make sure that that is not going anywhere that it's not supposed to go. Ransomware and other malicious software is a huge problem, especially during COVID, consistently throughout the United States. We have to make sure that all of our antivirus solutions are up to date to the latest antivirus versions, to make sure those are updated, and to make sure that we can protect ourselves against any kind of malicious software that's being unleashed in the environment. That's hugely important. And also a piece of this is patching all of the, from a technical standpoint, all the technology to the latest secure revisions, so things are performing as expected, but also all of those software holes are being plugged by the manufacturers or the software developers' updates. That's hugely important. The most cryptographic malware breaches that have involved all of these common risk factors are not having the latest and greatest antivirus definitions updated, combined with not having the equipment patched appropriately. And on top of that, there's another piece to this, is if you're using cloud applications that people can log into remotely, the concept of multi-factor authentication, which is something you have, meaning a password, and I'm sorry, meaning like a mobile phone, and something you know, like a password. You need the combination of these two things to access those cloud services. So between those three things, a lot of companies have fallen victim to cryptographic malware breaches, and it's important to make sure that, again, you have your patching of all your endpoints and services up to date. The antivirus signatures and products are up to date as well, along with anything that's internet facing. You implement multi-factor authentication, which is something you have, like a cell phone, and something you know, like a password. Okay, next page, Jared. And the other piece of this is, how often do external vulnerability scans run against the remote access environment? What does that really mean? That means that somebody like you know, a penetration tester or a company runs scans with a piece of software against anything that you have that faces the internet. So if you have a computer that's plugged into the internet, that's a web server, for instance, running a vulnerability scan against that web server will identify any kind of known issues from a security perspective that are associated with that particular product or technology. So it's important to do that so you understand what your security profile is for things that are exposed to the internet. So it's a good idea. I like to do these for our Cisco managed services clients. We perform those monthly, and we report against our findings with senior management on a monthly basis to make sure that we have continuous improvement against our externally facing external security environment to what the world sees, to make sure we're keeping that up to snuff and making sure we don't have any problems with that. The other thing that I like to review on a monthly basis is who has escalated privileges in the environment. So we have, you know, the concept of having super administrators in the environment. That's necessary to make sure that, you know, the managed service provider or the IT function can make changes or has the ability to be able to keep the information secured appropriately. But we also like to make sure that we look at who has those privileges. So we like to also review those on a monthly basis. So we make sure that there shouldn't be anybody in the administrative group that really shouldn't belong there. Then again, we like to review the types of services that we're getting from managed service providers or our internal IT function. what are they doing to protect our file storage and document management piece? And again, this goes back to the escalated privileges piece. Do they have access to things that they shouldn't, or does the folks that should have access to it have the appropriate access? So again, we like to review those things on a monthly basis. And for companies that are utilizing managed services exclusively without an internal IT function, are they performing all the work that they're contractually obligated to do? And how would we know that? So again, that's why I think reporting on a monthly basis against all those different types of activities that they're supposed to be performing, like patching the endpoints, making sure the antivirus is, at a state that it's supposed to be, performing external vulnerability scans against anything that's externally facing to the internet. All those types of things I like to report on a monthly basis. Because if you really don't do that, then how do you know that they're doing what they're supposed to do to keep you protected? Okay, next slide, Jared. Okay, so processes and procedures. Okay, I'm going to hand this section over to David.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and I think just from a process perspective, we hit on this a little bit in the resiliency section, but it's really important to understand the impact on processes, procedures, and update, policies and procedures as you have them to reflect changes and risks, and communicate. Find new ways of communicating things. So some of the risks and impacts that you could be experiencing, lack of clarity in how employees are supposed to work, how often they're supposed to report back. Did that extend to the remote work environment where you may have normally had staff meetings that were very easy to conduct in a conference room, and does that extend as easily to a work environment? Employees taking advantage of downtime or flexibility. I hate to say it, but that is a fairly significant risk that employees won't be as productive. On one hand, you need to be very, very empathetic to different situations. Homeschooling, people whose families may have been impacted by the pandemic, knowing that the workday is stretching longer and at a higher stress level than any other time, and so making sure that as you transition into this next normal, that it makes sense to design policies, procedures, processes in an adaptable way. The employee experience doesn't extend outside the walls of your organization. There are organizations who have onboarded, tens, if not hundreds of employees during this outage, right? So what does that look like, knowing that we may not go back to a fully physical work environment again? Have you looked at the employee's life cycle in terms of how they progress through their career, but also from onboarding to more routine monthly, quarterly, annual processes? Has that been adapted? Are you looking at things like labor laws and making sure people who are not able to work beyond their standard hours without incurring overtime or other things, that you're not violating those laws? Transition to the next slide. Some of the things that you want to make sure you ask, have you updated policies and procedures? That's kind of a no-brainer. Do your employees actually understand expectations for behavior, security, et cetera? And I think more importantly, have you asked them if they understand? Have you sent out a survey? Have you engaged with people in a way that is open and honest, so that you understand where there may be communication gaps? Have managers and staff been trained? In a hybrid or remote work environment, supervisory oversight management skills are not the same. They aren't. It's not the same. You can't assume that your managers understand how to oversee remote workforce. You can't assume that staff understand how much of the managing upward needs to be done to manage expectations, to over communicate, if anything, right? Are you leveraging adaptable communication techniques? Most of us have looked at Zoom, Teams, something like that, but have you actually put dashboards in place? Do you have task lists? Do you have project plans or lightweight project plans that may enable you to communicate in one spot and talk about the same things, right? Have you looked at where you're putting work products, specifications, documents, proposals, whatever your work products are for your business unit? Are you putting them in the same spot? Are you talking about them differently? And is that mutual value proposition reflected in that last bullet? Are employees valuing the employment experience in the same way? I think this is critical to be able to compete for, retaining employees, but also bringing on new talent. Are you able to extend that mutual value proposition? Transitioning to the next slide. Security, I'll just reiterate it because, earlier Eric spent quite a bit of time talking about bringing technologies to your employees. And I think this is just the centralized reiteration of the risk that may have changed for good. And so, employees not knowing what threats and security protocols are relevant. Are they looking at guest Wi-Fi or using their neighbor's Wi-Fi networks when theirs go out? Are they more susceptible to phishing attacks? Have you extended that communication when it comes to basics like troubleshooting, password resets, patching systems, knowing that there may be a heightened level of risk and there's more targeted attacks on home users? Looking at the threat surface area of your network. Your network now extends into a bunch of mini networks, throughout your organization, all of your employees and their home environment. So what does that look like? Have you adapted to change your security profile? And on the efficiency and effectiveness of communication side, we have adapted solutions. We have rapidly deployed solutions, but is it the best? Is it the most secure? Have you thought about these types of things going forward? So in transitioning to the next slide, very clear, some high level questions that you want to make sure you're asking. Eric mentioned before, have you implemented MFA, multi-factor authentication? I think anyone who's working in a remote work environment needs to consider multi-factor authentication. It's one of those critical controls that if you have a password plus another factor, a physical device, whether it's a phone or it's a token, that increases your security posture significantly. So make sure you're looking at that. Have you trained people? Have you reiterated training? Have you doubled down on validating training through phishing and a number of other things? Did you give your home users checklists to make sure that they are disabling default user ID passwords, that you set some standards in place for patching and monitoring their home systems? Are the communication protocols that you've implemented secure, or are there some holes in them? Are you patching the Zoom clients, for example? That's one of these things that I think is emerging, that if you're enabling your home, remote teleworking staff or remote workforce to use these tools, they need to be patched and secured as well. Next slide, please. Managing compliance and third parties. We talked about third-party risk a little bit more, but I think I would probably focus a bit more on compliance. So we had a period of time, and this certainly happened during the pandemic, where regulators and customers who you may have to comply with certain terms and conditions of a contract or regulations, there's some leniency. We had to adapt, we had to respond. It happens similarly to the next, whether it's a pandemic or outage, right? You have a period of leniency, but do you actually understand the compliance implications? Did you talk to your regulators or your customers as to the level of compliance that you are subject to, and did that change? Do you now know where your data is that you're obligated to protect? Do you know what your vendor's third-party telework, remote work environment processes look like, and what are the risks there? And so I think it's vitally important to do a reassessment on that compliance side. Next slide, please. I think very, very straightforward for anyone who's subject to data protection requirements or security requirements. You need to probably look at what controls may have changed and for how long, and whether it's a for good change in terms of security controls or protections that you have. What were physical that can't be done the same way in a virtual or a hybrid environment? And did you expand your scope of compliance? Did you look at where there may be issues with respect to duties and responsibilities, and what's the impact on that? how are you making sure that data is not in 15 different spots when it should be in one or two? And so what I mean by that is, having people remote opens up the door to them using their own technologies, storing things on their home network, storing things in the cloud, emailing things to their personal account. When there's a network or a VPN issue, just working around systems. And so all of that has some form of a compliance burden. It's critically important to make sure that you understand what the impact is on that as well, and knowing where the data is, knowing where there may be compliance implications for your organization. Next slide, please.
All right, this is our last poll question here for CPE credit. So we'll leave it open for about 30, 45 seconds here to give everyone enough time to get their responses in. Thank you, everyone. Keep it open for just another few seconds here to get those last participants in. Great, thank you, everyone.
Okay, next slide, Jared. Thank you. Okay, so to kind of summarize, what we would do from a teleworking strategy assessment, what we do for our clients is our team works with organizations to ensure a smooth transition into a transformed networking engagement with teleworking and environment using a three-phase approach. So we would plan, we do initial executive planning virtual workshop with your senior management team, determine objectives of engagement and scope of services. We would design an assessment, assess the risk, and review the mitigating controls of the key areas that comprise your telework strategy, develop a gap assessment, and the deliverable would be a summary report of design assessment and a remediation roadmap of how to get you there. We would also test operational effectiveness. We would review all the finalized policies and procedures with regard to the environment. We would assess and test operational effectiveness of a telework program. And we would deliver findings and recommendations report to you. So that would be one way where we could certainly assist, designing a teleworking strategy for you. So David, do you have any comments regarding that?
No, just to add, this is one of those things that is pretty nimble and adaptable. And look, if you are looking to have some visibility or some suggestions as to what you're doing, how you can adapt it going forward to be more nimble, more resilient, we do assessments fairly regularly that take on some of the components, all the components, and I think reach out to Eric or myself if you have any questions about this.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So Jared, let's go to next slide, please. And now we're in the question and answer portion of the webinar. So does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Eric, one that came in here is just advice for, trying to get started if you don't already have a business continuity plan in place, just some of the simple steps you could take to get started there.
So it really goes back to one of the first slides we talked about, which was, the 10 steps that are really involved with setting them up. But really the first piece of that is identifying everybody that has management or a leadership role in a functional vertical that you have in your company. So again, it usually starts off with management, manufacturing, HR, all those types of places, and all those associated systems that they use in their business line, right? So again, for finance or manufacturing, let's say there's a finance system that's involved with finance that usually stems across into the manufacturing environment. What would you do, or how would you conduct business if that system wasn't available? So it really starts with the identification of those folks that would participate in doing that, what they call tabletop disaster recovery exercise. to identify at a very high level where the gaps are in the different systems that you have. So you would start there. You'd identify those people, perform that tabletop disaster recovery exercise. What systems, how would you deal with it if they weren't there, and how long it would take you to get them back? That'd be the first part of that. And the second piece of that is driving towards the ultimate goal of resilience. So once you've identified those things, what would it take to make sure that those systems are, let's say, in a place that's not likely to ever go down, let's say like in Azure, AWS, or another cloud hosted place, where the biggest risk would be how to get your employees to a place where they get access to those systems. So again, from a risk perspective, it's performing that exercise, identifying those people, and then that would give you the start of really the detailed process. When you get those people together, they'll be able to give you some great information and how they're impacted and how to get them up and running as quickly as possible.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And then the other question that's come in here, is just relating to some follow-up here, and can we email slides out? Yes, the slides and a recording of this will be sent out shortly after. So I believe that's all the questions we have for today. So, thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. We appreciate you attending. And again, we'll be sending out the slides and the recording that'll include the contact information for both Eric and David here. So if you have any questions, you can connect with them afterwards. So again, thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate it this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.